Christmas Eve has always been a time of ritual in Ireland. Even today, you might have your own rituals. You might go to the same pub every year, or maybe your family has a special meal that you always have on Christmas Eve. But in Ireland, into the early 20th century, Christmas Eve was a time when ancient rituals were practiced every year to mark the beginning of Christmas. And in this video, I want to share some of these with you. Some might sound familiar, others have completely died out, and you could argue for good reason. Now, this is the second video I've made on Irish Christmas traditions. I'll link the other one in the pinned comment below and at the end of this video. But today I want to focus in on Christmas Eve because, as I say, it was so different and marked by a set of very ancient rituals that were pretty unique to Ireland at the time. Now, before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Fin Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian, and I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast. I'll link that beneath the video as well. There's tons of content to get you through Christmas there. Here on YouTube, I release a video every week. Do subscribe to the channel to make sure you get the next video when it drops. I have a long video coming out next week to get you through Christmas. In order to get our heads around the way our ancestors marked Christmas Eve, it's worth explaining a little bit about what Irish social life looked like in general in the past. So today, people are always on their phones. Obviously, this form of entertainment didn't exist in Ireland into the early 20th century. And there was a really strong custom, particularly in rural Ireland, of people calling on their neighbours every night. You find this in accounts from the early 20th century where people would constantly call to their neighbours, play cards, sing songs, tell stories. Now that has died out, but on Christmas Eve in the past, people didn't do that. That all stopped, and it was very much a family orientated event. So it's kind of the opposite maybe to the way we do it today. I think lots of us use the occasion to catch up with friends and neighbours. But on Christmas Eve in Ireland in the early 20th century, as I say, it was very much based around the family, and people had this very specific set of rituals they used to mark the day. And this began with the lighting of the Christmas candle. Now, this does exist in lots of countries around the world, continues today, but in Ireland in the early 20th century, it was wrapped up in all these ancient superstitions. So let's look at that now. It's a pretty common tradition in lots of cultures to light a candle on Christmas Eve, and this was very popular in Ireland in the early 20th century. Indeed, if people couldn't afford to buy candles, they used to make their own candles out of calico and animal fat. These were called tallow candles. Now, these were definitely not the nicest thing to light in your house because the animal fat would be stink when it was burned. You can imagine the stench of that. It must have been a bit like rotten meat. They also were really smoky candles when you burned them, but people did want to light the candle on Christmas Eve. It was a very important part of the rituals of that day. But on top of that, Irish people had these very specific family traditions where it was very important about who would light the candle. So in some families, it fell to the father of the family to light the candle. In others, the honour was given to the youngest child. And when I was researching this video in the folklore archive, I found that some families, if they had a child called Mary, they would be given the honour of lighting the candle. That's obviously a nod to the Virgin Mary, who was a hugely important figure for Irish Catholics, and particularly around Christmas time. On top of that, though, there was also other superstitions and rituals around the lighting of candles. So in some families, every single person in the family would light a candle, but it was believed that if your candle burned out first, that was a sign that you would be the first in your family to die. Now, I found that really strange. Why would you introduce that superstition around Christmas of all times of the year? On top of that, it was believed that the Christmas candle was very lucky, and in some households, the stub of the Christmas candle would be kept for the following 12 months, and it would be a symbol of good luck. Now, next, I want to move on to what's a very strange part of Christmas Eve rituals in Ireland that continued into the early 20th century, but I'm pretty sure no longer exist. And that's all around animals and a set of superstitions that they could talk on Christmas Eve. Animals have always played a central role in the story and imagery around Christmas, which is no surprise given that Jesus Christ was born in a stable according to the Bible. However, this sits quite uncomfortably with a folk tradition that you'll find right across Europe that claims that animals can talk at midnight on Christmas Eve. Now, the origins of this superstition and folklore is not really that well understood. It clearly isn't Christian in origin, given that Christians don't really venerate animals. However, this tradition and belief does appear to have been very strong in Ireland up until the late 19th century. The folklore archives, which I'll link beneath this video, contain thousands of stories gathered in Ireland in the 1930s, and many of these were recorded from older people in the 1930s, and they could recall Ireland back into the mid-19th century, and they talked a lot about this idea and the widespread belief in their youth that animals could talk at midnight on Christmas Eve. And it was, in some quarters at least, seen as maybe a bit dangerous, because there are stories saying that if you ever witnessed these animals talking at midnight on Christmas Eve, this would lead to your imminent death. However, in Ireland there was also other superstitions and rituals around animals that took place on Christmas Eve. For example, in farms that had a donkey, it was believed that at midnight the donkey might get down on its knees and bray, and that if you could observe this, that it was a very lucky thing. And in some houses they would actually bring the donkey into their house on Christmas Eve in the hope that they might see this. I did find one other story in the folklore archives which I found really strange, and it was only a couple of lines in a memory recalled by a man in his 80s in the 1930s, but he said that he could recall a time where people would go out and pray on the head of a cow at midnight on Christmas Eve. He didn't explain why they were doing this. It does seem quite strange. It's obviously not a Christian tradition. Now, where this comes from, I have no idea. If any of you have any idea, I'd love to hear it. Now, there's one other tradition that I do want to talk about in this video, and this actually comes from comments in my last video, where several people mentioned that they had witnessed this tradition, something I'd never heard of before, and then I found evidence of it in a folklore archive. In my last video, I mentioned how the days leading up to Christmas Eve were always a time of fasting and abstinence in Ireland. Christmas definitely wasn't the celebration we have today, and I also talked about how people would have very special meals. And it was a big time that after sundown, the family would light the candle and then they'd have a big meal. Now, for a lot of families, they couldn't afford to have very lavish meals. And in the comments of the last video, people talked about how they could remember their families, this was in immigrant communities overseas, but how their families would mark Christmas Eve by having something called Boxty. Now, Boxty is a potato pancake or a kind of a flat potato bread. And today you tend to find it more in the west of Ireland than in the east. I live in Waterford, which is in the southeast of Ireland, and you don't tend to find it as much here. But I was really surprised in the comments of the last video that people saw this as a Christmas meal. I've never heard of Boxty being eaten at Christmas time in particular. And in preparing for this video, I just searched that in a folklore archive, and I was pretty taken aback to find that in the early 20th century, Boxty was eaten in the west of Ireland, particularly on Christmas Eve. And there was actually very specific recipes about how some people made Boxty. And this is, I think at least, died out completely. I don't think Boxty would be eaten in any household in Ireland on Christmas Eve in particular. It is eaten throughout the year, but not on Christmas Eve in particular. Again, if you have any memories of this, I'd love to hear that, because I'd never heard of it until people commented on the last video, and then I was taken aback to find out that it was actually a very old tradition that seems to have been taken by people when they emigrated and then continued in various different Irish communities around the world. Now, hopefully in this video, I've given you a sense of how Christmas Eve was a really special time of the year in Irish households, and it was very much a time where you have a mix of Christian beliefs and then these older superstitions, like for example around the candle or the animals. But again, I'd love to hear if your family continue any of these traditions. Now, next week I have a completely different video coming out. It's much longer than this one, and it explores the fascinating history behind an Irish prisoner of war in the Second World War who had to build something called the Death Railway in Southeast Asia. It's a phenomenal story that actually explores the history behind the movie Bridge Over the River Kwai. So I'll be talking to you next week. In the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely Christmas, whatever you do, whether you celebrate it on your own and you keep it low-key, or you're going to spend it with family. I hope you have a lovely time. So until I'm talking to you again, Nollaig Shona Dhuit.